All right, so we are getting down to our last two videos, right? Um, we are looking at ecosystems as we move down that hierarchy of ecology, right? So we started with the population, and then we moved to the community, and now we're into ecosystems. And then after this, there'll be one more video on humans and the biosphere. Okay. Um, Recall that within ecosystem, that's going to include all the community interactions that are going on within it, right? But then also the abiotic factors within that community or that ecosystem, excuse me. So now we're looking at how matter cycles through the ecosystem, for example. Okay, so it's including all of the energy flow and all of the other kinds of interactions like symbiosis and things like that. But then we're also looking at abiotic factors. So let's start with those biogeochemical cycles that cycle matter through the ecosystem. Um, Obviously, water cycle, right? Super easy. You've had that since you were in elementary school, right? Um, Remember that you have really two processes that we discussed essentially in baby bio, right? We talked about sources and sinks, right? The source is the thing that moves the water through the water cycle. Those are the shuns, right? Um, Evaporation, transpiration, condensation, precipitation, percolation, right? All the shuns. And then there are sinks, right? These are places where water would stop and sit for a while. So that's the assimilation part, where water gets well, assimilation and reservoirs really are kind of collectively like the sinks in baby bio, and then the release would be your sources of water. So the ocean is a huge sink for water, right? Lots of water in the ocean. The air, right? Lots of water in the air, um, and so on. All right, so water cycle, I feel like we're good with water cycle. We're not going to say too much here. Carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle, you saw both of those in baby bio. Okay, and you probably at least saw carbon cycle in earth science or apes as well, right? So um, the difference really is, are the cycles biotically driven or abiotically driven, right? Water cycle is mainly abiotically driven. The only shun that moves water from place to place, which is biotic, is transpiration, right? And actually, you could probably add respiration to that too, because water is released as a result of respiration, right? And when you breathe in the winter, you can see the water vapor coming out of your mouth, right? That's where the water vapor in your breath condenses. So I think you can count that as part of it as well. But for the most part, if there was nothing living on the planet, water would continue to cycle because the water cycle is driven by the sun, right? It's powered by the sun. So that's why we say that it's primarily an abiotically driven cycle. The rest of the cycles, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and even the phosphorus cycle, are biotically driven. Okay. The reason why they're said to be biotically driven is if you removed living things from the planet, um, these this matter wouldn't move from place to place. Okay, it's driven by the activities of living things. Okay, so excuse me, with the carbon cycle, um, you have the atmosphere is a huge carbon sink, and obviously the ocean is a huge carbon sink, right? Because a lot of carbon dioxide will dissolve into the ocean. Fossil fuel, peat, and then organic material also is a sink for the carbon cycle. And then you've got assimilation, right? Photosynthesis is really carbon capture, right? It's carbon fixation. Um, excuse me. And then carbon moves, as animals eat plants and animals eat each other and things like that. Respiration and decomposition, as well as combustion, would release carbon back to the atmosphere. Where nitrogen is concerned, um, excuse me, the soil contains nitrates, nitrites, ammonium, and so on. Those are all nitrogen containing compounds. They're assimilated by nitrogen fixing bacteria. Okay, and there are different kinds of nitrogen bacteria in the or bacteria that play a part in the nitrogen cycle, really, within the soil. You have nitrogen fixing bacteria. You have bacteria that actually convert one type of nitrogen containing compound to another, right? You also have denitrifying bacteria. So if you end up with too much nitrogen in the soil, there are bacteria that can re-release that. Decomposition is also a way of moving nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Oh, and animal waste, right? Urine is a way that your body gets rid of excess nitrogen. It's a nitrogenous waste. And then we have the phosphorus cycle. This one's new. Rocks and ocean sediments tend to contain phosphorus. Plants absorb phosphates from the soil, and then they get eaten by animals, and that's where animals get their phosphorus. And of course, decomposition and animal waste will also release phosphorus. Right, so there's the water cycle, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to spend much time here. But here's the global carbon cycle, right? And, again, this isn't showing you everything, but fossil fuel use, right? Land use and deforestation put carbon into the atmosphere, right? Death and decomposition are going to put carbon into the atmosphere. And then mostly either you have uptake of carbon by plants, that's carbon fixation. You're fixing it into organic carbon. Which I know that sounds weird. We learned that organic compounds contain carbon. Um, Technically, they need to be bonded to hydrogen to be organic. Okay, so because carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is carbon and oxygen, it's actually considered to be inorganic carbon. When it's fixed through photosynthesis, it's converted to organic carbon. And then, of course, you have the ocean taking up the carbon. Okay, so all of those things move carbon. You have ice melt, other things that also move carbon into the atmosphere. All right, here's the nitrogen cycle. This one is a bit more complicated, and again, this is a simplified cycle, and I like that it's simplified. You're not seeing necessarily all of the bacteria that are involved in the movement of carbon, but you do have those root nodule bacteria, right, in the legumes that fix nitrogen. You have different bacteria in the soil that convert nitrogen into different forms. Um, you also have denitrifying bacteria that can actually move nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Lightning also is capable of taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere and converting it into soil nitrates as well. And then there's industrial fixation, and this is done for the purpose of making fertilizers. Okay, so whenever you create fertilizers, you fix carbon industrially in a big chemical process. All right, and then there's the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is also fixed industrially as well. When you're talking about fertilizers being made, those are made industrially. Excuse me. Again, you have to get the phosphorus into the soil in order for it to be taken up by plants, right? And then that's how it's going to move through the food chain to different groups of animals. But you also have phosphorus converted by living things as it moves. And also, one thing that we didn't see in the other cycles is there is such a thing as leaching. As water passes through the soil, sometimes it takes some of these dissolved nutrients with it, and then that ends up in the water table, but it's taken away from the soil. Leaching should ideally be minor. All right, so those are the biogeochemical cycles that College Board says you have to know about. Where biomes are concerned, there's a lot of slides here on biomes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the basics of biomes with you, and you're going to do an activity with biomes, or you have done an activity with biomes. And then I'll post the slides with it. So if you want to see biome by biome, the specific data of each biome, you can. But rather than spending the time going through them here, I'll shorten this video a little bit. So biomes are big ecosystems, okay, that have characteristics, biotic and abiotic factors. Okay, so typically, if you're talking about land biomes, they kind of tend to be determined by latitude. They're these big biome groups that are by latitude across the entire world, which desert in and of itself is determined by climate. Just usually what happens with a desert is there's a geographic area that has a feature that prevents maybe storms from getting to that area and dropping a lot of precipitation. So it tends to be very arid. And so deserts are actually found at all of the latitudes on the planet, not just at any specific latitude. But in general, as you move from the poles, right, on the ends of the planet toward the equator, right, the biodiversity of each biome increases and the biomass of each biome increases. And largely, this is due to the fact that the length of the growing season increases, right? You go from having real extreme temperature changes to having no temperature changes, right? A relatively stable set of environmental conditions year round at the equator. So the more stable your temperature is, the more opportunities there are to have a longer growing season. Okay, so at the tropics, there's a year-round growing season. And that means productivity year-round, which means the ability to support more life, right? Water biomes tend to be different. They're determined by salinity and depth. All right, so in the tropics, the land biomes are rainforest and savanna, okay? And these are just general ones. There might be some other groups that you might have heard of. In the temperate zones, you have the deciduous forest. That's our biome here in North Carolina. The grassland, and then the chaparral, which is it's kind of a coastal region. And it's determined by rainfall as well and the vegetation. And notice, in general, you get forests in these biomes when you have more precipitation. The less precipitation you get, the more you get grass or even like real scrubby bush vegetation, right? So the biomes have a specific climax community. So when succession goes on in these biomes, where it stops is at that climax community. And what the climax community you get is determined largely by by latitude and rainfall, right? You also have the northern coniferous forest, also known as the taiga. Like in parts of northern Canada, that's pine forests mainly, and there's the rainfall there. And then notice the tundra is even further north. That gets less rain, and it's also really cold most of the time. And then deserts occur at any latitude where you get less than 30 centimeters of rain annually. All right, so this little map kind of shows you the biome groups, and you can see these bands of different biomes across the planet. But again, the reason why you have seasonal changes or seasonal variations is that no matter what, sunlight is directly overhead at the tropics year round, right? But at certain times of year, because of the Earth's tilt on its axis, sometimes these middle latitude regions get direct sunlight, right? And then sometimes they're getting sort of light hitting at an oblique angle, which causes indirect sunlight, which means you're getting a wintertime season, essentially, when you're getting that indirect sunlight. But even when the specific hemisphere is getting direct sunlight, there's still a slight angle on the sunlight in the temperates, which is why they're temperate and not super hot like you get with the tropics. And then in the tundra, the reason why that's cold is because you have a real low angle of incoming sunlight. All right, so the water biomes. Again, with respect to salinity, you have freshwater biomes, which may not be free of salt, right? They may have dissolved salts and things like that from the soil surrounding them, right, that wash into these. But these are the lakes, the streams and rivers and wetlands. The brackish water ones are estuaries, and these are brackish simply means it's an area where salt water mixes with fresh water. So when you have, say, rivers running into the ocean, that little area right at the mouth of the river is usually referred to as a brackish water area because it's not as salty as the ocean, but it's also not completely fresh. It's saltier than the fresh water. And then, of course, you have the marine biomes, and those are the ones that are in the ocean. When you're looking there, in the ocean, you're looking at distance from shore and also depth. So the intertidal zone is this zone between the high and low tide, where certain animals can live there. And then the ocean zone, the oceanic zone, um, out in the open ocean, you have the pelagic zone that's over the open ocean. And this is split into two regions known as the photic zone and the aphotic zone, although oceanographers often talk about a twilight zone that occurs in between, where you have sunlight, but it's more of a gradient. It's not sunlight, darkness, right? There's not a line. It's more like, essentially as the sunlight is filtering in through the water is going to filter out a lot of the sunlight. So there's a shallow region on the top of the ocean where you have water or sunlight that can penetrate the water, and the water then tends to be warmer, right, and brighter. And then it gets darker and darker and darker until you hit the aphotic zone where no light can penetrate to that depth. Coral reefs are always in the photic zone, okay, because a lot of corals rely on algae and things like that. And then the benthos is the ocean floor, and that has its own set of conditions as well. Okay, so here we go. So the pelagic zone is the open ocean. It's the photic zone plus the aphotic zone, and those are really water column zones, right? And then the benthos is the bottom of the ocean.